Great, great. So before we get going, we're going to have a prayer. So if you would bow your heads and remove your caps. Lord, our most holy Father, the creator of all, creator of things we see, things we don't see, everything we taste, we touch, we smell, it all comes from you. And we give you great thanks today that we could gather together in the land where we are free, where we acknowledge those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice for our freedoms. And we give you great thanks. And we give you thanks for the food that we will have today. And we give great thanks for our volunteers, for the Bronstein Foundation that helps support us. And we ask your guidance on all that we do, that we may carry the message to the generations that come after us, that freedom is not given, freedom is earned. And we ask that your blessing on the rest of this day. Amen.
Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And Larry Head is ready to go today to sing the national anthem.
Thank you, John. Feel free to join me. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Play ball.
Testing. Good morning. Before we introduce the main speaker, I've got a few announcements, if you can bear with me. Kathy Renner is right here in his airplane, and going out here and show your airplane and yourself, I guess. But she is advertising what's going on this Saturday from 10 to 12 downtown. They're going to have things for kids. So if you've got nieces, nephews, or kids, you might come down there. Is that the right time? And it's free of charge?
It's free of charge, 10 to 2.
10 to 2 on Saturday downtown on Main Street. Yeah. Okay, we'd love to have you there. And Cole, could you give me that book there? Thank you, Kathy. And Kathy's in charge of the P47 Foundation, and she'd like to talk to any of you. This is our educational committee. It comprises about 15 to 20 people, and they just created this book. We'll pass it around, let you look at it. It's a coloring book that talks a lot about the P47 and what we did during the war. So we'll pass this out and let it go down the rows and back just so you see. It took them a lot of time to put this together, but this is for kids. If you got grandkids or nieces or nephews, you might let them, you might buy one of them. Christmas is coming up. Let that pass around there. Okay, a third thing, is I know all you're of the generation that you like pinball. Pinball is a very interesting little game, but we were given by David and Nancy Willis 8 pinball machines. 3 of them are really collector's items. They're at different prices. If you're interested, you can talk to Mr. Cole Hughes. He's helping with everything over in the dark shirt. If you want to look at them, or if you're interested in buying them for yourselves, for your living room or basement or wherever. But how we got those, Mr. and Miss Willis, or Mr. Willis's mom and dad grew up here and then went to Indianapolis. Mr. Willis has been collecting pinball machines for about 50 years, and he just won a bunch of money from the one-armed bandit, so he needs a write-off. So we're lucky of that, but we're luckier he's married to Nancy, and Nancy's his wife, and she said, I want you to get rid of those pinball machines. So they were given to us, and we're selling them. So if you have anything that's of some value, you can donate it as a write-off, and we'd be glad to try to sell it or give it back to you, one or the other. Those are some of the announcements. Another thing we're having this Saturday is we're having Young Eagles. You'd have to get on the website called EAA. Young Eagles are kids between ages 8 and 17, and we have 10 pilots that are going to help fly them around the city. And we've done that about 2 other times at our museum. We had 26 and 54. We hope to have 60 kids. They have to have parental or guardian permission to fly with us. The private pilots have over 1,000 hours each, and they will fly them in a circle, and they will learn something, and they get a lot of free things. So if you want to sign up, you have to get on the internet. If you don't know how to do all that, you can ask Cole, and you can sign up your grandkids or nieces or nephews, but it has to be their parents, not you. That's coming up this Saturday, and we start at 8 in the morning. We're over at 10. There are also tank rides that day. We do tank rides every other Saturday. There's only 3 places in the country that you can get tank rides in other places: Dallas, Texas, Boston, and Vegas. So you can drive to one of those places, or you can ride one at our place. Ours is not air conditioned, and it doesn't have any shocks, so don't expect it's going to be a smooth ride. Now, the other thing is, a week from now, we're having a fly-in. We've spent a lot of time. It's an event that's next week, the 28th and 29th of September. And what's going to happen there is we've got a B-25 flying in, and you're allowed to get on the B-25, and they'll fly you around, and you'll see what a World War II plane was like. They also have, I think, a T-6 plane that you can get in the back of that and fly as well. And if you want to do that, it's not free, though, so you'd have to pay if you want to ride in that. But a lot of people are very interested in that. That's most of Saturday and most of Sunday, a week from this Saturday and Sunday. Love to have you for that. The last thing I wanted to talk about is, before I introduce the main speaker, is person 2 to 3 weeks from now. We're having the National Park Service come here from Lake Erie. They're coming from Putin Bay. At Putin Bay, it's right northwest of Cleveland, about 50 miles. It was very important in the War of 1812, where the British were beaten by the Americans with lots of ships, about 7 ships or 8 ships each. They're coming down to talk about that battle. It was a turning point in the Revolutionary War. Commodore Perry was the hero. We had 2 big ships, and one of them was just about knocked apart, and Perry got on a small ship because the other one didn't engage, and he went over to the other ship, and he had a flag that said, "Don't give up the ship." That was made by a woman, a seamstress. So it's an important battle. He went over to the other ship, and they beat them handily. So we'd like you to be here. That's the first Thursday of October, and we have 3 people in green uniforms. They're going to come here, and they're going to teach the educational people how to educate kids. They have a great big program. They do that across the nation. So now we got a very interesting speaker. My wife and I rode in the car with him and several other people. We went to World War I Museum recently, and Frank Morgan is ex-military, and he spent 2 years in Antarctica. So I think after he talked for a little bit of time, I understood I didn't know anything about Antarctica. So I think all of you will be enlightened about Antarctica, and I think he's a very good speaker, and I think you got a lot to learn about. So Frank Morgan, take it away.
And the moral of that story is be careful what you say around Dr. Browning, or you might end up here. So, as he said, my name is Frank Morgan. I want to do a little bit in the form of introduction because probably most of you don't know me. Maybe some of you have seen me at the museum. But welcome to this little talk. And yes, to answer a question, that is me, although that was about 40 years ago. And I am standing there with one of the more famous tools of the Navy, hence the name SWABI. And so first I want to tell you how it is that I ended up to be in this picture at the South Pole. I am from Western Kentucky, Union County, just a few miles down US 60. And those here that are good at history know that's the home of Camp Breckenridge. Yes. And so I'm connected to the history of Camp Breckenridge. My grandfather was the base fire chief. So firefighting sort of in my blood, if you will. And during World War II, about a third of his crew were German prisoners of war. And that's an interesting story all on its own. Around 1980, graduated from high school, went to college for a little bit. College did not agree with me. And so one day I walked out of a midterm test and drove across to Evansville, went to the recruiting station, walked in, signed up, went home. Made for an interesting conversation with my parents.
I bet so.
Yes, it did. Now, I signed up to be a Navy welder. Hull tech is the terminology. If you're older SWABI here, you probably know that as a D-seaman. And so they had D-seamen and ship fitters, and then they combined the rates, all right? And so they had that. I went out and I spent some time in the fleet on a ship called the USS Samuel Gompers, and she is the one to your right. And that was a destroyer tender. And here we are cruising around probably somewhere in the Indian Ocean. And so I served on her for a while. I did a Westpac cruise. We're anchored out, and believe it or not, a very hard to get to place as well as Antarctica, which is called Diego Garcia. I don't know if anybody ever been there. It's called the Footprint of Freedom. It's owned by the British, and it's in the very middle of the Indian Ocean. And it is difficult to get to if you're not in the military. It is a base that's used to house B-52 bombers and B-2 bombers and all types of forward deployed supplies, because in the vicinity of Diego Garcia is the Middle East. After I completed that time, I was given the opportunity to rotate to a different duty station. And I was given three choices. One was the USS Midway, now a museum. It was then out of Yokosuka, Japan, and it was always underway. So I thought, nah, I don't really like that. Another option was a Greyhound, a tin can destroyer out of Long Beach. And I thought, I don't think my stomach can take that, thank you very much. Anybody ever be seasick? You know. But at any rate, then he said, there's this thing called NSFA. What's that? He said, Naval Support Force Antarctica. I said, well, what will I be doing there? He said, what do you do now? I said, I fix things. And he said, well, I guess you'll go down there and fix things. I really thought when I went down there, I'd be doing what I did on board ship, was chasing little brown things through pipes and fixing toilets and all kinds of things like that. So I did not know until the day I reported to the command, which is home ported at that time in Port Hueneme, California. It's about an hour west of Los Angeles. And it's a CB base. We got a guy over here who's got a CB hat on, and I wore CB greens because we were attached to the CBs. So I went there, and then I found out that I was now going to be part of the last all-Navy shore fire department left in the world. It's not left anymore because they have transferred its control over to the civilians, and so they've had that. But it sounded neat, and I thought, well, I'll go there. So I spent all summer going through all kinds of schools, and a lot of them I did up the road at a place called Chanute Air Force Base up here in Rantoul, Illinois. It's now also decommissioned. Everything that I've served on is either decommissioned, bulldozed, or sunk. So, at any rate, and a lot of you probably identify with that. So, did all that there, and after a while, towards the end of the summer season up here, we get ready to go down there. Now, we do all kinds of schools, because you got to understand, when you're in Antarctica, you're responsible for your own life and livelihood. There are no options. There is no mutual aid. Mutual aid is a day away or a week away. So you fix it or you're done. And so everybody that goes down there has to be qualified at least as a first responder. And that includes everybody from the typist yeoman that works in the office to the smartest doctorate guy from Stanford with multiple degrees. And we were the ones that got to teach them. I credit that experience with my ability to stand in front of you today. Because the shy kid from Union County, Kentucky couldn't do this. But when you're forced to get up in front of other people and have to do it, after a while you get a little comfortable with it. Maybe. So there it is. That's at the airport at Christchurch, New Zealand. That is and has been the home port, overseas home port of Operation Deep Freeze for over 70 seasons and continues to be so today. They rent space from the New Zealand Government Airport Authority, and they have our little base there. New Zealand in itself is a gorgeous place if you've ever get to go there, and I know I've talked to a few that have. It's wonderfully clean. You can drive down the road there and barely find a scrap of trash. You can't go from here to the Lloyd Expressway without getting a garbage bag full. So it's a very impressive place from that standpoint. The people are extremely friendly. This is Christchurch Cathedral, where before we deploy every year, we have a worship service to dedicate and ask for God's blessing on our safety. Sadly, most of what you see right there is not there. It's being rebuilt because in 2011, a major earthquake leveled a large chunk of Christchurch, New Zealand. And there's statues around town. That's Scott. He's a famous explorer for the British. We'll talk more about him later. That's the Avon River, goes through town. It's just gorgeous sights. Even the trash cans get in on the act. So this is the Christchurch Museum. This shows you a little history. I don't have too many of these, but that is a first version of an Arctic snowcat. It did not work very well, so they put it in a museum. Eventually, the fun gets over, and the time we have with the Kiwis is over. And by the way, I'll say Kiwis several times. That is slang for New Zealander, and it is not a slur. They appreciate it. They understand. And so our time there was done, and so it's time to load up and head south, further south. Most of the air ops down there are on C-130s, but at a little window of time, the ice is hard enough and thick enough to where they can land rubber-tired planes. And so this is a C-141 Starlifter operated by our friends in the U.S. Air Force. And so we loaded up on this for about a 5.5-hour flight down to McMurdo Station. This is an early view of what the continent looks like when you first get where you can see something. Now, what you see as far as dirt and mountains and rocks there, don't get used to it. Most of Antarctica is buried under tons and miles of a polar ice cap. But I took this picture for that reason and also to show you the difference. If you can see right there, there's kind of a change in a line. So from here in, that's Arctic cap. That's polar cap. And this in front of you is what's known as sea ice. And it will vary depending on season to season and the environment. But it's going to be anywhere between 3 to 12 feet thick. When we come into getting ready to land, I need to tell you a couple things about where McMurdo is. Now, I don't have a map, but I do have some pictures over here, and you can see what Antarctica looks like in some of this imagery. Feel free to take a look. But it is on the edge of the Ross Sea, Ross Ice Shelf. And if you may have heard about it on the news because the Ross Ice Shelf itself birthed icebergs of epic proportions. Some of them about the size of, say, Delaware. And that usually kind of makes the news. And so Ross Island is on the edge of that, just where the sea ice transitions into more permanent ice. And it is fastened, if you will, to the continent by permanent ice. Ross Island is the home of Mount Erebus, which you see in this picture. Mount Erebus is the southernmost active volcano in the world. It's the only active one on the continent. And yes, it continues to erupt to this day. It spews and chokes and does different things like that. And every once in a while it throws things up in the air. This is what's called a lava bomb. And you can take a look at it after I get done. And it's shaped because it was molten when it went up in the air, and it cooled and made this little teardrop looking thing coming down. So it throws those things at you every once in a while. And of course it's someplace that they're going to study as well. As you're coming on into town, This is a distant view. The town itself is right here. Now this is technically called McMurdo Station. I'm going to call it town or MacTown from here on out because it's just easier to say. But there it is. And the cone-looking thing right here, that's a volcanic vent. And it is inactive, thankfully, but we call it Observation Hill. So it's a pretty long flight coming into town. You get there, there's where you land most of the year. Now, 40 years ago, I wish I had a better camera, and if I knew I was standing for you today, I'd have a better picture of this. But this is known as Williams Field. So we operated 2 airfields and a heliport. And I did firefighting crash rescue for all those. And so Williams Field is a skiway. And everything that lands there is obviously on skis. So the C-130 Hercules, which I'm sure everybody pretty much knows what that is. You've seen it in 1,000 movies, maybe even been on one. They're the big dumpy looking thing with a tail that drops down on them. But our Hercules were fitted with skis. So he had rubber tires and skis. So in Christchurch, you just draw the ski up and land on rubber tires. In Antarctica, obviously the other way around. So Williams Field's out there, and all those little dots that you can barely make out, those are actually C-130 Hercules, and there's one taking off right there. This little line you see right here is a road that comes into town. And there's the other end of the road, and we've had a storm. And when you have a storm down there, it blows everything around and rearranges the snow. And so it has to be cleared off. So we have the guys in operations are out there using snow plows and snow blowers to clear that road out again. Road's several miles long, and it is identified its entire length by flags. They are red and green, which is port and starboard. And so as you're driving down the road, sometimes the wind will come up, a storm, and it'll obscure your vision. It's good to say right now a few things that are true about Antarctica. It is the coldest, highest, windiest, driest place on Earth. So coldest, it's been measured down to negative 125 below zero, 127 below zero, as if 2 degrees matters. All right, it is the windiest. We're not talking about winds that come from hurricanes or tornadoes. Just regular old everyday wind has been clocked in excess of 200 miles an hour. One day I was going on a survey between buildings in the camp, and I went from one building to the next building, and the wind came up and it picked me up. Kind of picked me up like a leaf, and it blew me across the snow and ice, and I just kind of spread eagled like this and slid, and finally came to a stop about 100 yards away. Serious winds. It is the highest continent because the average thickness of the ice cap on the continent is 1.5 miles thick. So the mean elevation to sea level is at least 1.5 miles pretty much for the entire continent. And it is also the world's largest desert, which doesn't make sense to a lot of people because they go, what do you mean desert? Look at all this ice you've got. Well, we've got all this ice because it's a blooming cold forevermore. It just adds up and adds up and adds up and adds up. So while the Sahara is the hottest desert, Antarctica is the largest. So we come into town. There's a better view. So I've gone up on top of Ob Hill, and I've taken a picture down at McMurdo. It's a little Wild West looking. It's a little less Wild West looking now. If you were to go on Google and search, there's all kinds of websites you can go to see pictures and all this kind of stuff of the stations today. But about half of these buildings that you see in this picture are still there. They've modernized a little bit of it. But I'll draw your attention to just a couple of them. So the big tan one that's in the middle right there, that's a huge building. And the 2-story end is all dormitories for several hundred people. The middle section is the main galley and then engineering on the right. In the summertime, again, the seasons are reversed. You're the southern hemisphere. So winter up here, summer there. So in the summertime, you'll have a population of about 1,200 souls at McMurdo Station. About 400 of which are really, really smart people. And they are, we call them beakers. They are the scientists of the world. Many of them from United States universities or partnering universities. They're coming down there to do innumerable bouts of research, and I don't have time to go into that right now. But they're there, and we are there to support them. And specifically, the reason why the Navy was part of that is because we were known as cheap labor. So, we were, because, you know, the Navy and the military in general does not recognize a 40-hour work week, nor do they pay overtime. So, a couple other buildings you have there. Hotel California. This red and white striped one, that one was near and dear to my heart. That is the fire station. So when we were coming up that road the very first day, a picture that I wish I had, one of them, is this. As you're flying on that C-141 and you're getting about an hour or so away from the continent, the Air Force guys up in the cockpit turn off the heat because they're Air Force guys and they don't like Navy guys. No, they do it on purpose so that the cabin chills down and you start putting on all the layers of clothing and gloves and boots and things like that that you need to have on. And I can tell you this, and I can testify to this, it's not enough. Because the picture I want to have is of my face when I got off that plane. Because my mustache froze instantly. And it was one of those moments, and you've all had them in your life, where you've said this phrase, how the heck did I get to this place? All right. So that was an experience. And then you get on a bus, Ivan the Terra bus, and you ride into town, and you're going into town, and you're cold, and you want them to turn the heat on, and they say, well, the heat's on. And as you're coming up the hill into town, as you're coming up there, you look out the frosted windows, and you see these bunch of lunatics that are half naked with steam coming off of their bodies standing on the back of one of these buildings. I come to find out that I'm going to be one of those lunatics because that was my fellow firefighters I was getting ready to join. Another town or building there, the one with all the antennas on it, that was our main operations area. So that's air traffic control, weather, and so forth. It's called Max Center. That's where all the muckety-mucks live. Usually I went down there for maybe a meeting, and hopefully I wasn't in trouble. Just different vehicles around the town. You can see things with tracks on them, great big heavy rubber tires and all kinds of stuff like that. As a matter of fact, that bus I was talking about is right here. And then this is Observation Hill in the background going up. And you see three buildings, green buildings, about halfway up there at the top of the hill. The one on the left is the water treatment plant. Navy EVAPs, same thing you operate at sea. And did about 35,000 gallons of water a day. Divide by 1,200 people is not a lot of water. So all that kind of stuff went into effect. And to the right, those green buildings are decommissioned when I was there. That used to be a nuclear power plant, which when other people found out that the Navy put a nuclear power plant down there, they complained. So we had to remove it. It's another story for another day. Just a little bit there showing the background. I'll back up to that picture to show you this fancy little building right there. Looks really nice. It's called the Chalet. And you go inside of it, and it kind of has a feel for a church. Big open windows and a balcony, because it was built to be the base chapel. The National Science Foundation went in there and said, this will make a great office. And so they let us have, for the church, this little old Quonset hut right here with a plywood steeple on it. There you go. So they have now built a new chapel of the snows on the shores of the bay right there. Back to the fire truck. So this is a military 530B deuce and a half fire truck. And this was my baby for 2 seasons on the fire side of things. And the nickname of this was the Killer Bee, all dressed out in yellow and black. And it was just an awesome vehicle. And we had a number of structural vehicles. And then we had the stuff for outside for crash rescue. And so this is known as Crash 1. And at the time, it was the largest vehicle on the continent, period. And these types of vehicles were actually developed for the northern oil fields and development up in Canada and Alaska, but they seem to work really well for that footprint that they have down there. But that's a firefighting package with both AFFF and Purple K on it, on the back. And if you want more questions about that, see me later. But there's other ones. And we also had some that I don't have pictures here today that had tracks on them that drove like a tank. So we had those as well. I got a day off. And my second year there, I received 2 days off where I was actually off duty, wasn't required to respond, could do whatever I wanted to. And so on one of those days, I took the pickup and drove down. This is Hut Point, and so this primitive building you see to your right is called Scott's Hut. It was built right at the turn of the century, as in 1904, by Scott, one of Scott's expedition. Now, Robert Scott, he really desperately was trying to be the first man to make it to the South Pole. And so I'll get my date right. I'll flip on my notes here a little bit, because he tried several different times, and this is his little building. It's a museum now, and I will tell you that inside of it, everything looks like a time capsule because it's so cold and so dry, nothing decays. Even to the extent that there is a seal in there that they killed for food that is still there. It doesn't decay. It never thaw out. And there's very little bacteria. So those are good. By the way, not having bacteria means you don't smell. You don't have to use deodorant in Antarctica. I don't know why I said that. Just an interesting little tidbit came to my mind. On January 17th, 1912, Scott made it to the South Pole. But he was disappointed because when he got there, there was a Norwegian flag had already been planted there 34 days ago by Ronald Amundsen. And he had beat them to the race to the pole. And so dejectedly, Scott turned around, came back home. However, he didn't quite make it. They had caches of food and supplies as they went along the way, but their health and conditions had deteriorated to the point that just 3 miles from safety, from getting to another cache, they perished. So they did not make it. It's a dangerous place. That danger is exemplified. You can't hardly see it unless you're up here close, but there's a cross up here. I told you that the airfield was called Williams Field. Petty Officer Williams was a CB dozer operator and in the construction battalion. And in his efforts there, he broke through the ice and went down with his dozer. And so this is a memorial for him. Beautiful day. By the way, the air is so clean and dry. You're looking across the channel to the continent proper, and that looks like it's next door. It's 120 miles away. All right, those are very big mountains on the other side. That's called Mount Terror across the bay there. That's another cross. That is George Benson's cross, and Benson was the first of Scott's party to die. He tripped basically at a cliff and fell into the water and didn't make it there. The fire station itself, I don't have too awful many pictures inside of it, but we made it our home because it was our home. And so we lived there. We lived in the bunk room upstairs. We had our own galley because there were so few of us. To give you an example, we're operating fire and safety operations for this Williams Field, the ice runway, the heliport, all the town, and all its other things. And we're doing this with a staff of 20. All right. The civilian staff to do what we did today is in excess of 50. I don't think it's any cheaper. So, obviously you can see we're coming in on Christmas. We've got a pool table which doubles as a great big dining room table. We had a weight room, we had dartboards, we had books and various things like that in there. Christmas, we had epic meals. I cooked a lot down there. And if you got invited to the firehouse for a holiday meal, it was a treat because it was far superior to what you were going to get into the galley. But there was a price that you had to pay, and the price was you got to do dishes. And so that guy standing there, his name is Commander Simmons. He is actually the executive officer of the entire command, and he is scrubbing my pots and pans. It's kind of awesome. And his helper is the operations boss. This is Lieutenant Commander Rotten Harler. Rotten was his call sign. He was an intruder pilot, A6 driver off of carriers earlier in his life. He's a great guy. He's friends of mine today. He's retired up in Fort Walton, Kentucky. All right, so we're on duty, and it's just excitement all the time. And obviously it's a staged picture, but we did have a dispatch center for the base operations. We did have a working hospital. We had ambulance. We did all those types of things as well. And so we were generally fairly active. I do have people that go, what do you mean? How can you have fires in Antarctica? It's too cold to have a fire. Hey, first off, you got 1,200 people trying desperately to stay warm. And so people sometimes do stupid things. Yes? And so that comes about. Plus just normal wear and tear. It is so dry, so desperately dry down there that hoses, belts, anything rubber rots out and will break down. And that includes fuel lines. So, hypothermia treatment tank. We're Navy guys, we're kind of crafty. We wanted a hot tub. And the command would not authorize a hot tub. However, if you reclassify it as a hypothermia treatment tank, we're in blooming Antarctica, by the way, it got approved. And so we had a hot tub. And to explain a little bit about the steam coming off the guys. When we knew that when a group was coming into town, a large group, especially scientists, because they're civilians and they're silly anyway. And so as they're coming into town, we knew that. So we also had a sauna, a dry sauna that we also built out of a closet. And so about a half a dozen of us would strip down to our skivvies and we'd get in there, set it at about 180 degrees or so. Yeah. And then they would bang on the door when the bus was coming up the hill, and we'd all pile out there on the back porch and just sit there and smile and wave with steam coming off our bodies. We did other neat things. You got to break up the routine because the life there is, it's just day in, day out cycle. And by the way, I should say it's not day and night cycle, it's day. So the sun, by the middle of summer, by around the holiday season, the sun's doing this. That's all it does. That's 24 hours. And then as you get closer and closer into fall, heading towards winter, it keeps going in larger and larger circles, and then one day it goes below the horizon for the first time, which is, of course, an occasion for a party. So we do that. But this is a chili cook-off, and we were having big fun with that. These are friends of mine, the fire department. We had ours. Our team was called the Pyro Mutants. And there were 2 awards. One was for Best of Show, and one was for Best Chili. We obviously were going for Best of Show. And so he's dicing the tomatoes there with a K-12 saw. And this gentleman looking at the camera, that's Captain Shoemaker. He was the Navy's commander. The guy next to him with the aviators on, he is the head scientist, if you will, and they were part of the judging panel, and we screwed up. We won the best chili. So we had the best chili, and we did on with that. There's other wildlife down there. A lot of people identify the South Pole with penguins, and first off, let me tell you, there are no polar bears in Antarctica. Polar bears at the other end, that's up north. So these are known as skua gulls, and if you've seen the seagulls at Gulf Shores or Myrtle Beach or someplace like that, these guys are 2 to 3 times the size of the seagulls that you're used to. They're very hardy birds, they're scavengers, and they really love hot dogs. And these guys are more identifiable. That's an Adelie penguin. There are 7 varieties of penguins that live on the continent out of the 17. And so this rookery was within easy driving distance from the base, so we could go over there and look at them. The emperors were also on the island, but they were on the other side, and we weren't allowed to go there because we weren't scientists. And so there you see the penguins, and they're neat little birds. They're not a little bit afraid of you at all. They will move away from you, and you can't pet them or anything like that. But they'll let you get up and get nice photogenic pictures. There were dogs down there when I was there. This is a sled dog. So the Kiwis I mentioned earlier, on the other side of Ross Island, there was another base. It was the New Zealand base, the Kiwi base, and they still used dog sleds. Had used them for decades, and they continued to use them for quite a while until the Antarctic Treaty was amended. And when they amended the treaty, they outlawed non-indigenous life forms being brought down there outside of humans. And so they forced the Kiwis to take their dogs away. And that was sad. The dogs were wonderful, and I got several dog stories. That is the Kiwi base, those green buildings you see down there. And by size-wise, it looks a lot smaller. It is. There are about 80 people where we're 1,200. We also shared people. This is Kevin Boniface, the one that's not me. And he is a New Zealand Army firefighter, and he was on loan to us, and we had one of our guys on loan to them. One of the privileges, among the privileges, is the fact that I got to travel around the continent. I was, rank-wise, I was a home maintenance technician second class. So I'm an E5 as far as the military is concerned. National Science Foundation and the Fire Service looked at me as an assistant chief. My badge is up there with 3 trumpets, and the Science Foundation considered me to be the fire marshal of Antarctica. And so I was authorized to go to all of their operations and bases around the continent for safety, training, inspections, so forth and so on. That was a great privilege. You know, I wasn't stuck just in McMurdo. One of the places I went was to Bird Surface Camp. It's out in Queen Mary Bird Land, named for Admiral Byrd's wife. And it's mostly a little bit of research, but it's a refueling station, and it's an emergency airport in case something goes wrong at Williams Field. And so it's just out there on the ice shelf. And you see out in the horizon, that's what most of Antarctica looks like. Most of Antarctica is just nothing but endless miles and miles of flat snow and ice. And just remember, where you're standing there, you're probably on at least a mile of snow and ice under your feet. There's a C-130. And the story that I like to tell here is all of the remote stations, flight ops there were dicey to a degree. Because you had an improved runway in McMurdo. You had a sort of well-maintained one at South Pole because of the number of operations. But everywhere else, it was a chance. And so what you would do is you would drop down on the C-130, and you'd make a full-speed run skimming across the surface of the ice. And then at the end of that, you would take off, and you would go around, and everybody would go to the windows and try to look for crevasses. All right, cracks, big cracks, wide cracks in the ice, because the snow would bridge across them. And so you hoped that by going across that would collapse those, and so you know where it was safe to land. And normally that worked. Not always. Another base I went to, this is about halfway to the South Pole. The distance from McMurdo to the South Pole itself is about 800 miles, so this is about 400 miles south. This is in what's called the Beardmore Glacier area of the Trans-Antarctic Mountains. And Antarctica is not famous for mountains, but probably the second longest mountain chain in the world is the Trans-Antarctic Mountains. They go up to about 16,000 feet. And you see about the last 1,000 feet sticking up. So it's kind of like Hawaii. When you think about Hawaii, it's a monstrous mountain, but it's covered by water. So is this, it's just frozen. So Beardmore, there's a glacier there. There's all kinds of scientists doing things, studying the glacier and the area around it. There's the coming off the plane. You see that the props are turning. They'll feather those props and keep those engines under full power. If the conditions are bad enough, I had to go on a deployment one time for a different reason, that the conditions were so bad that as we came in for landing, they started lowering the back door. Before we're to a full stop, we're kicking off supplies. Soon as it comes to full stop, we're jumping off because they've rotated the props under full power. And then as soon as the last man steps off the ramp, they rotate those props back into fashion, and off they go. And their goal is to be on the ground and stop less than 90 seconds. All right, because it is so cold that the fuel will gel in a running engine. So, yeah. Anybody want to go? These are James waves, and these things still exist and still being used down there. This is World War II technology. These were developed for cold weather operations World War II. They were used a lot in Korea. They used some other places along the way. They used them up at Adak and up in Alaska and different places like that. And they're still using them. It's just basically an insulated tent with a diesel fuel heater in it. Air ops and whatnot. Now, I want to back up one just while we're here. So, among the things that they're doing there, they're doing geologic studies. And so one of those James Wade's was a laboratory building, and I went down through there with my escort as I was making sure they were doing things right and safe and all that kind of stuff. And there's a table full of rocks, and he hands me a couple of rocks, and this is one of those rocks. And so you think, well, what's so special about a rock? The special thing is this is petrified wood. Now, put it in perspective, where are I? All right, I are 400 miles from the South Pole, and I'm holding in my hand a piece of petrified wood that's 250 million years old. All right, so things haven't always looked like they do in the world that we live in, have they? So, at any rate, I found that was pretty interesting. What did I do? There it goes. All right, so from Beardmore, we go to a place called Dry Valleys. And the dry valleys are unique in Antarctica because, as you see, there's no snow, or very little. And because of the wind conditions and how it lies, it just continually gets scoured clean of snow. So of the less than 5% of turf that you can see in Antarctica, a whole bunch of it is right here. And so these are friends of mine I was taking pictures of. That's called Lake Vanda. And during the summertime, the melt will liquefy there, and you can swim in it if you choose. By the way, a couple of weeks ago, we had one of these cousins at our airport, right? At our museum. So this is a UH-1N version, Huey, modified for Antarctic service. And this is all that same thing, the Dry Valleys area. So this is the picture that got me in trouble with Dr. Browning. Because as we were going down the road, you know, you start talking about different things, about what you saw at the last place, what you hope to see at the next place, and how far it is to Cracker Barrel. And so we're doing all these kinds of things on our trip, and every once in a while you just got to jumpstart conversation. So I kind of offhandedly said, well, you know, I have walked around the world. Now, you can't make that comment without somebody rising to the bait, and they're going like, wait, what? You know, walking around, that takes a long time. The world's a pretty big place. However, if you go outside of this little marker right here and take 24 steps, you're effectively going in 24 different time zones, and you have walked around the world. And so this is me at the geographic South Pole. And this one right here moves around because they resurvey it. The snow and ice under your feet is in constant motion. It's always traveling north from this point. That's the only direction it can go. So it's always moving around. So every once in a while, they'll go move it a couple inches here, a couple inches there. What I'm standing on right here under my feet is a minimum of 9,000 feet of ice. About 6 inches of snow, 9,000 feet of ice. And then you get to terra firma. This is the one you take pictures of it. It's got the globe on it and all the treaty nation flags and whatnot. This is the ceremonial pole. I look like I'm comfortable. Yes, I'm doing this for the picture. Immediately after this picture, I'm putting everything back on because it is in excess of 40 below here. Yeah. This is South Pole Station number 2. Number 1 is gone. All right, this one is gone. If you go online now, you'll see the 3rd iteration, and they have learned a lot. So when you build something on top of all that snow and ice, human activity generates heat. Not much, but enough. We also generate vibrations. And so heat and vibrations cause you to sink into the cap. You know, you get buried a little bit by the snow blowing on top of you, but you can move that, but you can't stop the sinking thing. And so the new station now has got stilts where they can keep jacking it up. So they're hoping it lasts longer. This dome is not actually a heated building even. It's just a weather cover, if you will. Inside of this dome is a bunch of orange buildings like that. And that's where you live and do your work and eat and all these kinds of things when you're down there. As a friend of mine was giving me the tour. So you can see, so you're going downhill into that main entrance. When that was built, that was ground level. And this is only about 20 years worth of effect. All right. off to the left and right looks like big Quonset huts, and that's sort of what it is. The one off to the left, that's nothing but fuel. Nothing but fuel storage. You run out of fuel down at South Pole, you die. Off to the right side is engineering. So you got the power plant, snow melt, garages, and all those kinds of things. I went down there for a day-long inspection. I spent a week because the weather went from bad to worse. And so they canceled flight ops. So I got to spend Thanksgiving down there, so I helped cook. And so they're not refueling the plane. They're taking fuel off the plane into that storage bunker. And so that's the principal job of flying planes down there for about a 3-month window, is in the back of that C-130 is this great big fuel bladder full of JP5, and they keep pumping that off. Fuel is a primary commodity. You know, second only other thing is food. So a lot of that stuff comes in courtesy of our friends in the U.S. Coast Guard and 2 supply ships, 2 ice hardened vessels. One's a fuel tanker and one is a container ship that bring down a lot of stuff. And because we are right on the edge of the Ross Ice Sea where you can get to sea ice here is only about an average of 3 feet thick. It's nothing. And so the icebreaker, that's the Polar Star, she comes down and she'll break out a channel and we build an ice pier. We literally make our own iceberg out of reinforced cable and water, and we make a pier for them to tie up to. And they come into town, and you can see the tail end of the tanker as she comes in to bring fuel. When the fuel ship and the supply ship come into town, it's all hands on deck to make sure we get all those things in there. This picture right here, I don't know if I can zoom in or not, but at any rate, you see the flags. In the middle of that is a statue to Admiral Byrd, and he was Medal of Honor winner. He made the North Pole, South Pole. He's the first person to land a plane at the South Pole. It's called the Que Sera Sera, and if you want to see it, it's in the Pensacola Naval Air Museum down south of here. It's a beautiful plane. And at any rate, so that statue is to him. The flags you see around him are the original treaty nations. So Antarctica doesn't belong to anybody. Now, if you look at an atlas or a globe, sometimes you'll see lines that'll say British territory, it'll say French territory or Argentine claim or what have you. All right? Because back in the day, it was a real thing where you could go and you could take your flag and you could put it in the ground and I claim thee in the name of Queen Isabella or whatever. All right? I wonder when that stopped. I've thought about going across the street in my neighbor's yard and going, hey. Until you try that in Kentucky, you'll get shot. But at any rate, that's what a lot of countries did back in the day. And so they had claims on Antarctica, and a lot of these claims overlapped. But there were a couple of nations that didn't have claims. One was the United States. Another one was Russia. Another one was China, kind of big players. And so they basically said, we're not going to recognize anybody's claim. And in a amazing sense of cooperation internationally, this is a success story. And all the strife that we have everywhere else in the world, here's a place where it works. All right? So the nations that govern Antarctica got together. Originally it was 12, now it is 57 that have signed the treaty, have gotten together and they have a cooperative agreement that Antarctica belongs to nobody, and it is to be exploited by nobody, and it's to be used as a research location, and everybody shall share your research. So things that the British guy discovers out of Scott Base gets accessed by the guy from China, or the one from Vostok Base, Russian, gets accessed by the United States. It's all cooperative. So that's kind of a neat thing. So there's a lot of good that comes out of that. You can discover things. You can discover that there's coal. You can discover there's oil. You can discover there's all kinds of minerals and resources down there, but you just can't mine it. All right, you can't do anything about it. So, this is, I think, an appropriate end. Flag on the fantail of the USS Samuel Gompers. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation as much as I have enjoyed giving it to you. So, fair winds and following seas. And any questions? So if there's any questions, I'll take them. I don't know what you do now. I don't know if you do answer questions or if you are all dismissed and you can come up and talk to me however you want to do it. I'm game.
They're going to pass out some mics. When were you in the Navy?
Okay, spin the microphones around. Number one, tell us the difference between the North Pole and the South Pole.
One's up.
Land versus ice.
Okay, so the South Pole is a physical continent, all right, which means if you're a submariner, you cannot cruise underneath the South Pole. You can cruise underneath the North Pole because it is floating ice on top of the ocean, the Arctic Ocean. The other big distinction is the thickness of the ice. At the North Pole, you may have seen pictures of a mast of a submarine poking through because they can break through the ice. You can't break through 10,000 feet of ice. 90% of the world's fresh water is contained in the ice of Antarctica. Just a minute.
When were you in the Navy?
I served from 1980 to 1986.
Okay. Is the museum still open down at Breckenridge?
Yes.
It's a great
Yes, it
place to
is.
go to.
It's worth going to just to look at the artwork. If you've not been there, there was a German prisoner who is quite the artist down there, and he put beautiful murals. Not only there, a lot of them are at the museum, which was the NCO club, but there are also several around town. There's in the post office, and there's a barber shop that has one on the wall. Anybody else?
Other questions? Go ahead, this lady.
You know, we keep hearing about global warming.
Repeat it. Say your name.
My name's Carol. You know, global warming is in the news every day, every day.
Yes.
What do you think, what is happening in Antarctica?
Well, I use the word climate change because that's exactly what's going on. The climate over centuries has gone one way or the other, and right now we are in a defined warming cycle. One of the interesting things about the ice in Antarctica is that it is a record of the history of the world. So what happens is snow falls and it turns into ice petals, gets compressed and so forth. But when it does, it scours out of the environment everything that's going on in the world in microscopic DNA level stuff. And so they have core drills going in different places around, and each foot of ice core you're going back, you may be going back 250,000 years. All right, and they will analyze that, and they have seen changes in volcanic eruptions and different things that have happened in the world. Currently, what I will tell you is that it is evidenced in Antarctica by an increase in the calving of icebergs coming off the shelf and a few things like that. But it's probably a few million years before it's all gone. So I'm comfortable that there's a master plan out there that supersedes that.
Another question. I'm Don Johnson. 2 questions. Number 1, with the cold temperature, how do you handle the fuel? What keeps the fuel from gelling down there just in the normal use of the vehicles? Question number 1.
So for us in the fire service, the firehouse in town, in Mactown, was a heated structure. And so we had bays very similar to having a fire station here in the United States. And so they were inside heated. Now those trucks also had auxiliary heating packages on them for when we were out in service. But when you're out on the ice for runway operations and things like that, it's a different animal. So one thing you do there is you never shut your vehicle off. All right, they run 24/7, so maintenance is a huge deal. And then they also have heating packages on them. That big fire truck, that crash truck I showed you, all right, when I said it has AFFF on there, some of you understand what that is, but it is that foam that you see that they use at airports. Well, that's liquid. All right, so those containers there are insulated and heated by the engine package and everything on that truck. So yeah.
Question number 2, with the high winds, how did you handle the flight operations?
Some days you can't fly. The ones that were most susceptible to the high winds were obviously heliops. They are more susceptible to it. There are times when you may have to land. You may run into conditions where the storm comes up and you have to stop. And that affects a lot of the other things. So that road I told you about with the flags, those flags are 25 feet apart. So from me to the end of that table there would be the next flag. There was a time when I was driving to and fro from the base and in my pickup truck, and I was sitting right here, and there's a flag right by my door, and I cannot see the next flag. All right? And so the wind is blowing, so I drive up about this far, and I still can't see that flag. At that point, you should stop, because you can't tell what direction's what. All right, and by the way, compasses don't work because the magnetic South Pole is north of the South Pole. All right, but at any rate, you have to stop, because if you inadvertently drive between those two flags, somebody's going to have to find you someday. All right, there are also black flags, and black flags are danger. If you happen to drive to where there's a black flag, somebody gets to write a letter to your mother. Good question. Anybody else?
Right over there.
Hello,
Hi.
This is Mark. I was in the Navy at the same time you were.
Okay. I remember you.
Yeah. And, well, could have been. And anyway, I think it was an incentive back then that for every day you were in Antarctica, it was like 1 day off your contract or 2 days off your contract.
Not true.
No?
And if there was, they didn't tell me about it.
In regards to supplies, I was at Christchurch once, and I was on one of those planes, and what happened? It was empty, and I think they went down to the South Pole, and it came back full, I guess. Can you tell us how you got some? Would you ever fly an empty plane?
Rarely. Yeah, there had to be a special circumstance for that, for something to go to the South Pole empty. That'd be an odd thing, so I don't really have an answer for that. But to kind of add on to the thing about supplies, so getting fuel and food to the South Pole, you've got air ops, but that is very much subject to the whims of nature. And so out of a 3-month period, you may lose a month worth just because it was too terrible. So they have created the Antarctic Interstate Highway System, which is a trek road that goes from McMurdo to the South Pole. And they pull big sleds behind tractors now. They make a trek per season to take those down there. And that's quite the event to get the bulk of materials down there. Now, since everything's going down there, what happens once it's down there? Not everything is consumed, yes? All right, you just had lunch. What do you got on your table? Piles of trash. All right. When I was down there, regrettably, we were less environmentally conscious. And so we had a dump. Actually, we had 2 dumps. One dump was up on top of the hill, and one of the jobs of the fire department was to blow up the dump. And so we would go up there and we would set fire to it and have a controlled burn for all the combustible materials. The other thing was things that don't burn. Things that don't burn sink. So we would take them out and this is not trade secret, this is what we did. All right, sins of the past. And so we would take it out onto the ice shelf and we would surround it with explosives, and somebody got the honor of turning the key, and you would sink whatever that was. And that could be a broken down dozer that's no longer to be repaired. It could be a lot of different things. Now, things have changed. So nowadays, what happens, there's an entire department down there whose job it is to manage the recycling program of the world's premier recycling program. Everything that is waste is treated, contained, put in containers, and so when that container ship comes down and they offload everything from copy paper to dry goods and stores and cases of beer, and all those kind of things that they bring, they get loaded back with a whole big pile of shipping containers of debris that comes north. And that's used batteries, whatever it is, motor oil, all that stuff now comes back to the United States where they throw it in one of our landfills.
You didn't talk about any of the animals. Can you tell us the 10 most common animals you saw?
The 10 most common animals? 10 most common animals. Number 1 was the skua gulls, because they were everywhere. Number 2 would be penguins. 3 would be leopard seals or seals. I did have the privilege of seeing a killer whale or a pod of killer whales in some open water that the icebreaker cut open. But another thing is there is a quote-unquote an aquarium at McMurdo Station. Now, it's not like the one in Chattanooga or any place like that. It's a research area. And so you go in this building and they've got all these pools and tanks. And some of them they've got sea urchins and starfish and different things like that. But one of them that's kind of spectacular and maybe has made the news for you, and especially you're a doctor, is the Antarctic cod. All right, it's a very large fish, kind of like a big channel cat in size. And they have a unique feature about them as a fish swimming around in the water there. It's salt water. And anybody who's made ice cream in the summertime knows that salt water is colder than regular fresh water, yes? And so to keep that fish from freezing, it produces a natural antifreeze in its body. And so they have been using that, the scientists have, to do things with cryogenic surgeries and things like that. So that's another reason why they do it. But yeah, so I got to see a few more animals that way.
Why did the National Science Foundation in the United States move out of there?
They haven't.
There?
Yes.
How long have they been there?
They came along pretty soon after. So historically speaking, serious operations in Antarctica started in 1956. That was known as the IGY, stands for International Geophysical Year. And so during, of course, this is Cold War, this is after World War II and things like that. But again, a cooperative effort of the scientific nations around the continent, world, all got together to do all kinds of research projects everywhere. Not just Antarctica, but the North Pole and the Amazon and the Atlantic Ocean and the Marianas Trench, all these different places, and they shared that knowledge. Well, the Navy was part of that, again, cheap labor resources, and so they went down there then, and that's when they established the first base, if you will. And by saying that, I need to explain that I told you earlier, Antarctica doesn't belong to anybody. Yep. All right. By the same token, you must possess it to keep it. So there are some hardy souls that live at the South Pole through the winter, which for them, winter is 7 to 8 months long, of which there are no flight ops, there are no things like that, and they're called winter overs. And you have to have that because the South Pole is coveted real estate, if you will. There's a lot of places people would like to be there. All right. Well, the way the law works down there, if you leave it alone, if you unoccupy it for whatever reason, then somebody else can move in. There's really no questions asked. So if you want to possess it, you have to keep the lights on, keep the heat on.
There was a lady doctor down there in the
Yep.
90s or 2000s, and
great
she had
story.
breast cancer.
Right.
And a lady from Indiana University, Kathy somebody, directed her how to remove her breast cancer
She
herself.
did surgery on herself.
Do you know the whole story?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah. That's exactly right, because you cannot, I mean, they tried the logistics of what can they do and everything like that, and what they were able to do was to make an airdrop. All right. So again, through consultations and sharing of information and diagnosis, they were able to come up with a treatment plan. They were able to teach her over the internet how to do this surgery on herself and the chemotherapy to follow. And they were able to get all that stuff to her in a medical kit because they flew down to the South Pole and they kicked it out of the back with a parachute attached to it. They do things like that. And they dropped that stuff down and they went out there on the ice and found it and rescued it and brought it in, and she was able to do that with the assistance of some non-medical people.
Kathy Miller from Indiana University.
It's a
Health
great
Director.
book. I've got it somewhere at home.
Anybody else? Go ahead. We got one more over there.
Yes, my name's Keith. You were talking about the extreme temperatures and the wind speeds, and I understand you have very updated clothing to protect you. But how do you protect yourself from hypothermia? I mean, it just seems like there's got to be unexposed, uncovered skin somewhere along with the way that. How do you protect that?
I guess the easy answer is the best you can. Discretion is the better part of valor. There's times when you don't go outside. A lot of the buildings on the main station are interconnected now with tunnels. But another two interesting points that brings up. One is I've told you several times it's very dry. And when it's very dry like that, you ever hear of, you can live in Phoenix because it's a dry heat. All right. Well, a dry cold is similar. Your body doesn't sense it quite the same way. You don't sense wind chill when it's that cold. All right. And so you can be lulled into a false sense of security, if you will, because you become acclimatized to that. In the middle of summer, 20 degrees below zero, I would transit from building to building dressed like I am right now. All right, CB green pants and a t-shirt, wouldn't even have gloves on. And I'd walk from building to building. You got to where that was okay. Now, I didn't stand around and hang out in it, but I could go from place to place. So you get desensitized to it. The bad part of it is sometimes you don't have too many options. We responded to a vehicle fire out on the ice shelf, and I had to go out there, and I was part of the team that put that fire out. And by the time I got back, my hands had swollen inside of my gloves to where they had to cut my gloves off. So, hazards of life. Should have got a medal for that, I thought.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you, Frank. Appreciate it. Great talk.
Mark.